Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Kusum Wijetilleke. My guest today is Shanaka Amarasinghe. Shanaka is a lawyer, a commentator, and an actor. Hi Shanaka, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. So seeing as you're a lawyer, an actor, a journalist, commentator, we have a lot to cover, so we'll jump straight into it. You've just returned from the Birmingham Theatre Festival and the Edinburgh Theatre Festival, where you've been taking part in the play Counting and Cracking. So I'll leave it to you to just tell us a little bit about it. But just for our audience, I want to note that the play Counting and Cracking was given rave reviews by the press in the United Kingdom. Just two places are, quote, a vital tale for our times, a touching and gorgeously staged tale by the Scotsman, and a beautiful spectacle, the Herald. So would you like to tell us a little bit about Counting and Cracking?
Yeah, we were really happy to get 5-star reviews from the Times and 4 stars from the Guardian. So it was a really well-received play, Kusum, and I'm just so privileged to have been a part of it. It's a story about 4 generations of a Tamil family, and of course their singular friends, their singular relatives, their staff, all of that. And how that spans 1956, which was a watershed year in Sri Lanka historically, 1983, which was another really strong year in terms of the Tamil people's history, and then in 2004 with the ceasefire, how those families come back together, how the splinters are brought back. So it is a play that spans 4 generations, 3.5 hours, which just goes by in a flash because it's just such a well-told story. Story that I think has needed to be told for perhaps the last 40 years or so. And finally, we're seeing somebody, and it's not a Sri Lankan even, not really a resident Sri Lankan, who's coming out and being brave enough to tell this story, and I think it was fantastic to be a part of that.
It's the kind of thing that needs to be discussed more in Sri Lanka, I assume. It's the kind of story
I think so.
Should find an audience here.
I hope it does find an audience, but I had a very interesting response from somebody who traveled to watch the play in Birmingham. And he said, you know, I was watching this story, and he was my age, so he was 5 years old when 1983 happened. Okay. And he said, look, I was watching the other people in the audience, and when he's talking about other people, he's talking about people from other nationalities, local British people, and you know, other people that had come to see the play. And he said he saw them being so moved by the play, by the content of it, by the story, by the emotions, that he felt he almost had permission to start feeling about that event in history. And that's something that I found really interesting, because I was wondering if it was a completely Sri Lankan audience, we being ourselves, we might just shut down and be like, no, you know what, that never happened. No, that's not an accurate story, and just purse our lips and just walk out and pretend nothing has happened. But being in a different environment, I think it hit people, Sri Lankans who watched it, and several did, it hit them in a really different way. It was nice to see how other people empathized with our conflict and the fallout of those conflicts.
I mean, I was born in the mid-80s, so you're a little bit older, but do you remember that time? Because my reference point for our conflict is the 90s. I don't remember much from the 80s at all, to be honest with you. So how do you remember from your childhood growing up, especially being in the local school system, how did you feel about within St. Thomas's and within your social groupings? Do you remember much in the late 80s, for example? Was it?
Well, mid to late 80s, yes, I do, Kusum, because I had, I don't know whether it's the privilege or the misfortune of having a father in the military.
Right.
And so he was very much actively involved in the conflicts, where he was in Mathura during the JVP times, and then he was mobilized operationally in Jaffna, in Ampara, in Kokilai, in Padavia, you know, all those areas that were pretty hard hit. So I probably had a first row seat to how things were going, and I remember how he used to have to leave, and you know, as a small child you don't really process the thought of, is he going to come back? But looking back, you know, I look at how my mother would have had to deal with that, and yes, so I do remember it quite well. And I think there are a lot of people also who were similarly affected, who don't really have an outlet, who even 40 years later find it very difficult to talk about. So, and that's just the people who are family, but the people who are actually involved in the conflict, soldiers, foot soldiers, to officers, to combatants, to LTT cadres who have been rehabilitated. What are we doing about their PTSD? What are we doing about their stories? How are we telling their stories? So it's a huge can of worms that I don't think anyone's willing to open.
So you must have had the play itself must have had a certain emotional response from within you, because being a Sri Lankan, being around in that area. You mentioned it was over 3.5 hours long. Could you tell us a little bit about the dynamic you build with an audience over such a period of time? I mean, you just told me off camera that you were on stage for 35% of the time. So you must need to have a lot of investment from the audience as well, because it's a long play. But at the same time, it's emotionally charged. So tell us a little bit about how you approach that.
It's a long play, but it's also a beautiful play, Kusum. It's just, Shakti's play is just an outstanding piece of writing. And I spoke to people who watched it more than once. And the thing about Act 1, it's just 1 hour long, and it draws you in, it gives you who the characters are, it tells a little bit of a backstory about the characters, sets the context. And then Act 2, which is also about just over an hour long, it has some big scenes. There's an iconic wedding scene. And then there's a couple more family scenes that really kind of hug you, but at the same time punch you while you're in a clinch almost. So I think people are left at the end of Act 2 with like wondering, wow, this is pretty powerful. And then Act 3 is pretty much a second-hand narration of the events of the day on 1983 in Black July, and how this family goes through that, how people, whether they were in the Sinhalese or Tamil community, how they actually dealt with that day, and the violence that ensued without really acting it out. It was just a suggestion of what was going on on the streets that day, and I remember a bit of it. I remember the mob marching down. I lived on Dickman's Road at the time, and I remember like 35, 40 people, and I look back now and I'm thinking, okay, there was 35, 40 guys with machetes and clubs and stuff walking down the street, but there's thousands of the rest of us. Why weren't we on the street like we were on the 9th of May? So that for me was a really nice turning point to see on the 9th of May. Although I abhor what actually happened, it was nice to see people are not just sitting back and watching their compatriots getting brutally beaten and attacked. So maybe the worm has turned. Maybe we are not going to be that kind of a nation anymore, but we'll find out soon enough.
I mean, it sounds like a fantastic play, Shanaka. What are the chances of it being brought down to Sri Lanka? Do you think we can work something out?
I hope so. I hope that the powers that be will realize the power of showing something like this. It's a trilingual play as well.
Okay, excellent.
So yeah, we've got English, Sinhala, Tamil. We've had people who are coming in from India. We had Australians all learning the Tamil language, all learning the Sinhala language from scratch in order to be able to perform this authentically. So it's a play that really needs to travel the length and breadth of Sri Lanka, not just Colombo. And we need to be able to see ourselves from the audience point of view, I think, and watch what might have happened differently if we just were a little bit more mindful.
Right. You were twice awarded the Best Actor prize at school. You led your school in shakes to victory, I think I read in your profile. So you have a deep resume as an actor. I mean, Glenn Ross playing Doctor. Also Midnight's Children, the movie, and based on the novel by Sumner. Could you tell us a little bit about Midnight's Children? What was it like being in a pretty major production?
Well, it was a major production, but I think Deepa Mehta does her major productions here because it's a lot cheaper for her.
Yeah, of course, of course.
So I'm under no illusion of that. But I played a nice little scene where I'm actually the one that tells the family that their children have been switched. So that was quite interesting for me. But it was nice to be part of that production, and it was very professional also. And it was also good to be a part of a professional production in Australia where we rehearsed for 3 weeks before going over to Edinburgh. And just sometimes I wonder how we even put on a play here in Sri Lanka, given the lack of resources and the professionalism with which they do things, approach things. And it was the first time in my life, I think, that I've been able to just act and not have to worry about pasting posters, printing tickets, finding sponsors, who's going to do front of house, that kind of stressors, without all that. So it was a really liberating experience as an actor for me, and I'm really grateful to have had it.
Had you previously had any experience with Midnight's Children? The novel, Salman Rushdie recently was brutally attacked for the thing. How did you, I mean, isn't it strange that I think the fatwa on his head was in the late 80s and it still continues today? It's quite something, isn't it?
It is, and you have to doff your hat to the man for being able to annoy people for the last 30 years.
Yeah, he must have really annoyed some people.
Yeah, but free speech is a huge talking point, isn't it, Kusum? So I don't think we're going to find any easy answers, but extremism in whatever form is something that I think we need to be really skeptical of.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to tie into the themes around counting and cracking Salman Rushdie and the issues around freedom of speech. Now, as a lawyer in Sri Lanka, I know you're engaged in corporate law as well as litigation, but you have an idea of the justice system in Sri Lanka. You know the pitfalls, the issues, what is it, justice delayed is justice denied sort of thing. I mean, it seems to me that a justice system is a pretty foundational aspect of any society.
Of any democracy,
Any
yes.
democracy, of any civilization. So, I mean, it seems that our situation is so precarious, given even what's happening at the UNHRC right now. We've been told for the last 13 years that we have to start making some major reforms at home, and it's just not happened. How do you see the Sri Lankan justice system, and is there any hope for us? I mean, this
Well, it's a bit difficult to be in the system and critique the system very forthrightly, Kusum.
I understand. Yeah.
But there are areas, of course, that need to be worked on in terms of implementation. I think there are a few draconian and anachronistic pieces of legislation, things like the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the emergency regulations and all of these things, which tend to have been abused by powers for their own gain. So you have to take a very Sherlock Holmesian look at this.
It's a role you played before, isn't it?
Yes, I did. And you had to stand outside and look, okay, who's profiting from this system? Are the litigants profiting from this system? Are the citizens profiting from this system? Is Sri Lanka better for having this particular system of justice? And I think you'd have to honestly say perhaps not. And then you have to see how do you reform that system, and that reform needs to come from within as well as without. There needs to be a change in legislation, but also there has to be a change in attitude and I can say this, I think there has to be a change in attitude of lawyers especially.
Okay.
And we need to be demanding more, we need to be doing more. I think some lawyers work tremendously hard, but maybe there's a case to be made for us to work harder and to make a real push that justice becomes not just some abstract concept, but some executive implemented thing that happens on the ground.
The current situation is quite stark with the members of the Argale being arrested for various things. We have to accept that there may have been individuals that have broken the law and thus should be prosecuted. But then when you go through some of the alleged crimes, the very simple things that are not
stuff,
trivial stuff. So, I mean, where are we heading in that sense? Because currently you have very, shall we say, notorious, or those leaders of those activists that have gained some notoriety. Even they have been, completely investigated, interrogated, etc. So, I mean, and the average citizen knows that this is being done under the PTA. We know the issues in terms of interrogation times, how long you can hold someone without presenting to the magistrate. We know all of these. I mean, most people in Colombo, at least, we understand this. But there's not much of a public sentiment against it that we see. How do you, or maybe there is, or how do you see it playing out?
It's simmering, Kusum. I think the public sentiment is simmering because if you go back to the petrol queues, at the time that petrol queues were, the norm, I think people were quite happy to be in a queue. They knew that, we're going to be in this queue for a few hours, maybe even a day or so. And I'm going to be able to get to the station and get my fuel. What really annoyed them is when people cut in front of them, when there were VIP convoys, when there were friends and family of the shed owners who cut in front. So that kind of iniquity is what is really upsetting Sri Lankans. And
injustice.
I think, yes, absolutely. And it's not fair treatment. So they're happy to know that, I'm not going to be able to go on my trip. I might not be able to go to office 5 days of the week because of this petrol shortage. But what they don't like is being completely shortchanged by the system. And I think that will come home to roost come an election if the authorities are not careful. And I think they have to realize that you can fool all of the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time, but not all of the people all of the time.
So Shanaka, you came to my attention initially as a teenager on The Score. This is a show you hosted for a long time on Yes FM, I believe. And you always had your reviews of the games, and it was something that, there wasn't much in the way of English language local analysis, especially of cricket, but many other sports. You've been involved heavily in the sports culture in the local schools How do you see that? We can talk about rugby and cricket separately, but just even in those two sports, how do you see the translation of talent from schools to the professionals? I mean, is there something that it's, for example, if we take Mahela and Sangha, now Sangha Kara, for instance, wasn't necessarily meant to be a Sri Lankan cricketer when he went through the school system. Mm-hmm. He was not up there, but even as a kid, I remember Mahela Jayawardene was in the papers regularly. Everyone knew that Anandan and Mahela would be, one of the big guys there. So, how do you see that translating now in the school system to the professional system?
Well, if you look at some of the guys that we are talking about right now in the Sri Lankan system, guys like Charith Asalanka, Vanidu Hasaranga, these guys all played for the same school team. And they've managed to come through and really shine on the international stage as well. But most Sri Lankan cricketers that succeed despite the system rather than because of the system. You know this well. So it is something that we need to address, because the professionalism at the lower levels really needs to improve. Because I was in Birmingham for the play, and I visited my old friend Narayan Ratwatta, who captained first 11 at St. Thomas's, and we went to watch his 11-year-old son play, and just the atmosphere around that game, the fact that everybody got a chance to bat, everybody got a chance to bowl, it was competitive. They were really making sure that participation was a big thing, but also the quality of cricket didn't drop as a result. So just to watch that was quite intriguing for me, because I don't see that level of investment from people in the cricket club, the parents, the well-wishers, the coaches. You'd have the chief selector of the club coming and watching even the under-11s. They're talking about who they're going to play in the county match the upcoming week. So people are interested in sport. In Sri Lanka, we don't really have a wide interest in sport. I think a lot of people just focus purely on studies. Innumerable number of talented sports people who have just stopped because they've got O-levels. I mean, what does O-levels do for you at the end of the day, right? And you're taking away that 15 and 16-year development period from a sportsman.
To really reach a peak.
Absolutely.
Start peaking.
Absolutely. I mean, you're looking at guys like in golf or tennis. That's when they're really hitting their straps. So we're taking all that away from them. And, I'm sorry, I'm doing A-levels, so I can't come for cricket practice. I've heard that countless times. So I think there needs to be a culture of sport which is outside of just the international sport. I remember being in Australia last month, and I just happened to play. I play ultimate frisbee, so I searched for a game and went down to the recreational arena, and you've got countless basketball courts, countless tennis courts, countless netball courts, and each one of them is being used. Each one of them. It's about 400 people in this recreational facility outdoors in the winter, and everyone's playing some kind of sport. But here, apart from a few runners here and there, or some hardcore guys that will get together and play a game of touch rugby, or somebody who's playing indoor cricket, you don't really have a culture where these sports are being fed. Mm-hmm. So that for me is the biggest problem, that somebody out of school doesn't really have a place to go unless they really want to pursue the sport. So
I mean, Naren Ratwatta is a good example, because I remember he's a fast bowler, is he not?
Yeah.
And his year was a victorious year.
Yes, we won in '99.
So he's another guy, when we were young, you would remember this really good bowler. Navid Nawaz, he's in the current, he played a few games as well, and did at least one or two internationals. So those were batsmen that, in Naren Ratwatta as a bowler, they didn't really come through for some reason. Like, well, what was the reason for this? Because it seemed like, when you think back, even later on, Ian Daniel, for instance, there were players who were scoring runs for fun in the international, in the local Premier League and the school system. How come they don't make that next step? And are there not enough places?
There's not enough teams. I think
that's
is
what
the
it
problem.
is. Yeah.
So if someone is not doing well at international level, you've got to have a tier below, which you can send them back to and said, just go and play a bit of cricket at this level, which is not too far of a drop. You don't want them going from A-levels to kindergarten, to use that analogy. You want them to go from first year A-levels to maybe the first week of A-levels, kind of. That needs to be the shift. So you need to have a really strong A team. You need to have a really strong club culture where good players are playing against each other all the time. And it's just competition for places, Kusum. Now that Dhananjay De Silva has come in and kind of established himself as a batting all-rounder, Charith Asalanka is going to be like, I'm going to be losing my place if I don't buck up. Dhanushka Wijetilleke has come in, and there's people like Niroshan Dikwella who will be thinking, hey, I'm as good as him, why not me? So that's what we really need to create, and unfortunately that's only being created at the international level. We need to be creating that at school level, we need to be creating that at club level, at A-team level, at just below A-team level. So if we are creating that competition for places, I think we can go a long way, but you'll know from the business world as well, from your years as a banker, that Sri Lankans have a natural aversion to competition.
Right.
We
right.
don't really like somebody else. If somebody in my industry is starting up a new thing, I will do as much as I can to crush him before he even starts.
Right.
And without saying too much, I can say that that kind of attitude is prevalent even in the sporting field. So
something I also noticed with friends of mine who were really good at school level. I mean, really good, and then they go into club cricket. But then even now, you have to have a job. You have to have something else. You can't make much money from playing club, even though they get paid per game in the Premier League. I think something small. So then it becomes a thing where you're balancing your cricket with your other things, and then there's a social life that creeps in. A lot of clubs in Sri Lanka, Premier League clubs have a very big social sort of get-togethers and those kinds of things. So then I feel like the level just kind of plateaus a little bit, where instead of coming out of school and going into a squad where you play hard and you develop your skills, most players just have to go into what's now a semi-professional sort of model. So that's kind of what you're saying, is you have to make it more professional.
You have to make it more professional. You have to put more accountability on the players. I mean, you remember Upeka Fernando, who passed away a few months ago, and he was a prime example. There was no way he was not going to play for Sri Lanka. But he went to the SSC and just completely lost his way because he was not disciplined enough.
I'd like to also talk about the rugby culture, Shanaka. I think we discussed before. I'm from an international school, so it's something that we really miss out on. Now, I've got my brother's kids, nephews, and nieces. They're really into the rugby, the local rugby culture. So could you give us a little bit of an idea and compare and contrast the two, the cricket culture and the rugby culture, and how come football, cause we both follow the Premier League, and we might talk about that later. Because someone's on top of the league now. But I wondered, how come football has struggled to grow in Sri Lanka, whereas rugby just keeps going from strength to strength in some angles?
Well, I think it's a cultural thing, because we've played rugby from the 1800s, Kusum. I think it was 1897 or something that the Sri Lankan Rugby Football Union was set up. And if I remember right, it's the oldest union outside of the home nations. So it's a lot of traveling Scotsmen, lots of traveling Englishmen who are up there in the hill country in places like Dharawal and Nuwara and places where the climate was great for them. So it's like a warm summer's day, except not as rainy. And so they thought, well, this is ideal for rugby, and let's just start playing. So it's the colonials that started the game off. Then the schools took it up. So Kingswood was the first to start playing rugby, and then Trinity College followed, and then Zahira College. And they were some of the oldest teams that played schools rugby. And then those masters who were maybe the headmasters, the masters in charge of games, who were still old English gentlemen, were pushing kids to play rugby. And it was one of those things that we always did, playing rugby and cricket. So that is part of our colonial hangover. But football is getting much more popular now that the Premier League is so much more available, that the Spanish League is so much more watchable now, with cable TV being very affordable. So kids are moving, I think, into football a lot more. But again, there's been, I'm sorry to say, but kind of a class divide, where football has been played generally in the inner cities, and you get your Javelins and your Renowns and those teams which are not from the most affluent suburbs of Sri Lanka. So there hasn't been a real crossover. So that's something I think.
So football isn't that popular in the school system?
Not as much as rugby is.
Nowhere near, I would assume.
Yeah,
right?
nowhere near at the moment. Yeah, but hopefully it will catch up. But that's because rugby had a head start of so many, maybe 150 years. Really.
There's a perception of there being a violent culture to rugby from outside. How do you sort of...
Well, I don't think it's any different, Kusum, to the violence that accompanies any kind of identity politics. Because when you are extreme about your team may be your rugby team, it may be your cricket team. We saw clips, I think, from the Afghanistan-Pakistan game. So it's not alien to any sport, really. And it might even be, your nationality that, you really get aggressive about protecting. So it's the same thing happens in rugby, and because it's a quote unquote a violent sport, I mean, people smash into each other all the time. So emotions are going to run high. But what I can say about rugby is that usually it's a flare up and then it's done, which is not often the case for some other conflicts. But it is a problem that needs to be addressed. I mean, we can't have referees being assaulted, we can't have visiting teams being assaulted, we can't have crowds coming onto the pitch. All of these things have happened recently, and I don't think there's enough decisive action being taken by the authorities, the schools or the club authorities, to say, sorry, you're banned from here on, and you didn't take proper precautions. But that being said, Kusum, I was watching PSG play Arsenal a few years ago in the Arsenal members stand. I'm lucky enough to get a ticket from a friend. And I have never felt so frightened for my life inside there, because the chanting is just so violent. If I was one of those PSG players taking a corner, I would have run back to Paris, because it's just so violent, that culture. And it makes our rugby crowds look kindergarten, to be honest. And it's a sad aspect of sport.
I tweeted something recently that wasn't taken very well, but I remembered that previously in cricket, when India used to lose a match, it used to get pretty bad for their players back in the day. It doesn't happen very often now, does it? So what's changed there? Has it become a bit more, a little more chilled out or something? Like, because the passion is still there. But I think people have perhaps changed their...
Well, there's more cricket being played as well. That's exactly one thing. Okay. So I think people have kind of got a saturation. Okay. And if their team loses on this day, then maybe the Mumbai Indians will win next week, and then maybe the Bangalore Royal Challengers will win the week after. So people are a little less invested in the national teams anymore. So because of social media and stuff, they're probably following players more than they're following teams.
Yeah, this is a good time to talk about T20 cricket, Shanaka, because I don't know if you remember, you'll probably remember the time when T20 cricket was one match at the end of a long tour. Yeah. It's usually a bit of fun, a slight commercial opportunity. Yeah. And now it's sort of taken over the game in a big way. How do you see the effect on Test cricket specifically? And also, I mean, personally, when T20 first came about, I felt a bit like one of those people who would call themselves a purist, who probably wasn't very happy with pyjama cricket and 50-over cricket. I felt like that when T20 cricket came about, saying, is it really cricket? I mean, you only have to manage 20 overs, you don't have to conserve wickets. It takes one part of the art form away, but introduces another. So how do you view T20 cricket overall?
So I share that view. I'm not a huge fan of the format. But you can't argue with what it's done to the game. It's just completely globalized the game. It's brought teams that might not be able to compete at the highest level, like Afghanistan, into the mix, and they're a genuine contender now. So that kind of thing is really good for the game, I think, and guys like Rashid Khan being a global superstar, it's fantastic for Afghanistan as well, and for the player. So T20 has given that opportunity, but Test cricket is still number one for me, and I will sit in front of the TV for five days if you allow me to, but
how are we going to keep players interested? I mean, a lot of people, we can see it, I don't want to mention names, but cricketers leave international cricket very early on now because they can get into franchise cricket, make a very good living. On the other side, you can't blame people because it's a career. You're not going to go until you're 40 as a cricketer. It's tough, you can. So there's an opportunity cost to this, and you clearly miss out. The international game will clearly miss out on some very talented players, especially in the Test arena, if we keep going like that.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem of the individual boards. You've got to make sure you play your players enough that they're not too enticed away. I mean, it happens at football all the time, doesn't it? Your friend Alex Ferguson would never allow players to go and play on international duty, and where the clubs became much bigger than the international game, except at the World Cup. So I think boards have to learn a lesson from that and try to make sure that their players play for the love of the country, and their fans also don't just follow the player as kind of an icon, but like to see him wearing a West Indies cap or a Sri Lanka jersey or that kind
For
of thing.
instance, that IPL goes on takes a big chunk of the annual calendar every year. That surely has to be a problem going forward. I mean, it's 1.5 months worth of one franchise tournament. It sounds a bit
well, a lot
excessive.
of people make a lot of money in that 1.5 months.
Yeah.
Kusum, you and I don't, but then
Yeah,
certainly the people who
It's
do will
irresistible
not,
now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the boards have also realized that money talks. There's no point in resisting this. I think there was a bit of a fallout with Arjuna Ranatunga when he was president of SLC, and he kind of was not happy about players missing a test match because of the IPL. Rightly so, we'd have to say. But it's money talks, and that has become an irresistible charge.
Is it something to do with the test game itself? Because now we've had, I think, one phase of the test championship was in New Zealand that won the test championship.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is something that I think to give test cricket and bilateral series some context, a league format makes sense. But it's taken so long for them to introduce this, and obviously so many challenges with the tour schedules and that. But how have you seen the league format for test cricket? Because I feel like that there's some potential, but is it?
Oh yeah, certainly. And I remember that final that they played. It was an outstanding game of cricket. It really was a fantastic game of cricket. And I think we need to start selling test cricket to people differently. You've got to look at a session, and that's almost as long as a T20 game.
Yeah.
And you've got to start marketing that in a different way. People have to start writing about test cricket in a different way. I think most of the writers really love test cricket themselves.
Yes.
So there is a bit of that happening, but it's just people's attention spans, isn't it, Kusum? I mean, people are moving from books to Kindles and from movies to YouTube videos. So again, it's inevitable that we're going to go down this road.
Is it something that maybe we can? It's a relic, test cricket. Let's be honest. It's a relic, but you can do a lot with a relic. Like you see our relics in Sri Lanka, right? You can do a whole song and dance around it. So maybe we can make something more, and maybe really sort of emphasize the fact that it's not one-day cricket, that you can actually take someone's head off, for instance, with the red ball. Now that's something that gets the blood rushing, right?
Of
you
course.
see someone bowling in 145, 150, and you know it's going to be a short delivery.
Yeah.
So maybe we can emphasize that a little more. Like, I mean, that.
And the function of that is what the West Indies did to test cricket in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, you had these guys who were just gladiators who were out there terrorizing everybody. And that's what I remember. And then you've got your Thompsons and Lillys, and then you've got your Wazims and your Wakas. And this is the reason people watch sport. They want to see a little bit of blood. We've moved on from the Roman Colosseum, but not too far. You know? Yeah.
I mean, that you mentioned West Indies is perfect, because the West Indies mirrors the Sri Lankan cricket story. The West Indies were I mean, obviously, they were untouchable for a time, right, in the 70s, 80s. They were literally untouchable, the best team in the world in both formats. And West Indies cricket lost its way. I mean, even though they had superstars like, you know, Lara and the Ambroses and the Bosch, they won very little, especially abroad. They had very poor records. So the Sri Lankan cricket, we had this brief spell, right, 95 to 99, where seemingly we had the best left-arm seamer in the world because Wasim Akram was injured. We had the best spinner in the world. We had some of the best batsmen in the world. We really milked it. We won several Asian Cups and all of that. How come we lost our way? I mean, you have a lot to cover in this answer, but there's corruption, there's mismanagement, selection issues, all of that. But could you give us a sort of, from as a sports journalist, as a cricket fan, how you saw that era, let's say up to the end of the Marvin era, from the 96 period onwards?
Yeah, it's a tough one to put a finger on, because I think there were several reasons why that happened. I think the players suddenly overnight became real stars. And that's something that's difficult for anyone to handle at any age, Kusum. And you notice that with the Kusal Mendis as well. You know, I interviewed him for Wisden in about 2016 or 17. He was the up-and-coming cricketer of the year. So I went to his house in Moratuwa. It was a house not bigger than this studio that we're in. A couple of families living in it. It was unfinished brick. He just made it into the national team. Unfinished brick. There was no color washing on the house, nothing. There was a 3-wheel in the garage. And then suddenly he's driving a Land Rover and meeting with an accident, and that kind of stuff happens. So it's such a sudden surge for players that it's very difficult to handle. And I think you and I wouldn't be any different if we got untold riches in the course of an evening. That's when our real problems are going to make
as a young adult as well.
Yeah. So I think that happened early on. There's no social media at that time, so obviously we didn't know what the players were up to, which is now captured on any camera. But I think there was a little bit of distraction for the players at that time, and they thought they could get by on talent. But what happened was the rest of the world started slowly catching up, and the rest of the world has and always will be professional. You take UK, you take Australia, you take New Zealand, you take South Africa. These guys make a living out of being prepared and just getting better 1% at a time. And they continued getting better. And the Sri Lankan talent was just not enough to counter that physicality and the strength and the different dimensions that people brought into the game in that period. And it was only after Tom Moody came in and people like Kumar Sangakkara and Mahela Jayawardene were savvy enough to see that they needed to keep up. It's when Tom came in that things changed a little bit and they started being a little bit more prepared. And that's when we had our golden era. So I think that's really what it happens, a combination of the players maybe thinking they were better than they were and the rest of the world catching up.
You had tweeted recently about, I think about Bhanaka Rajapaksa and the fitness issues so how do you view the fitness of a cricketer? Because as you said, I've noticed Australians, the British, South Africans, they've become athletes. I mean, proper. Even England used to have a few, like Graham Gooch, who weren't traditional athletes. Exactly. Mike Gatting, the captain for a while. But they've all kind of become more professional. You can see them; they look like they're working out. Jimmy Anderson is a perfect example, right? You can't bowl at this level. You wouldn't have been able to do it in the 90s.
16 years he's been going, right?
No way you couldn't do it in the 90s. How come Sri Lanka still, we see a few of our fast bowls with a little bit of a little extra flash? It's not a thing that you look at as a cricketer and say, oh, he can't be a cricketer because of this. It's not like other sports. There is some leeway. But do you think how do you view the fitness? Because you're in the fitness industry as well and you know a lot about this sort of thing.
So again, I think it's a cultural thing. I don't think we have a culture of fitness. Like I said, people playing recreational sports, it doesn't happen a lot here.
Right.
You're struggling to find 10 people to play a basketball game on a Saturday afternoon. It's that kind of thing. There are a few hardcore people, but it's not wide enough to really cast a net over and get some real talent coming through. So that fitness culture is not there. You won't find people often just getting up and going for a run. It seems to be something that is centered towards the walking paths that have come up in Colombo. It's not a wider thing where people would throw on their jogging shoes at the lunch hour and go for a 40-minute jog and come back to work. It's not that kind of a culture that we have. So fitness has not been something that a lot of junior cricket coaches have placed a lot of emphasis on. Because at that level, you can get away with being a big hitter of the ball, a good timer of the ball, all of that kind of thing. And then suddenly, by the time they come to the big leagues, being a good timer of the ball is no longer enough because the ball is hitting the bat so much harder because these guys are bowling at 10 clicks more than you were facing earlier. So then you don't have the tools to deal with it, and that's when players fall by the wayside. So I have heard stories where premier fast bowlers have come into the Sri Lankan setup and seen the inside of a gym for the first time at that point. I'm not even making this up. So, you're in your early 20s and suddenly you're starting to lift a few weights here and there, and then you don't want to be left behind. You might be thinking, if I can't do this, if I tell the coach that I can't do this, then what is he going to say? So players might be pushing themselves a little bit more. So it's a myriad of things. And that's why these people are breaking down, because they don't really have that training age that most other cricketers in their vintage would have in other countries like the US, in New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, because those countries are just, they live and breathe sport.
Do you think the younger cricket fans really, because we've had about a decade of mediocrity in the international game, do you think they really appreciate just how far, because you mentioned Sri Lanka has actually gone a long way just on talent, right? And just to give our audience an idea, from Arjun Ranatunga and his idea of pinch hitting at the top of the order with Sana Jayasuriya and Kalu Witharani, it changed the one international game at that stage. It wasn't something that people had really seen before. And then Sana Jayasuriya himself is still underappreciated in my opinion, because he's a a generational all-round. I mean, especially in the one-day game, there's just not anyone who does that. And there's certainly not anyone who's pinch hit at the top of the innings who can then go into Test cricket and score 300 or 200 quite regularly. He did it fairly regularly. We had the greatest of all-time bowler in Muttai Muralidharan. They had to change the rules because of the way he was bowling. I feel like he invented the word and the delivery, but the doosra was around before, I think, Saklin Mushtaq maybe. This Marlinger's action, never seen before in cricket, never tried before in international cricket with any effect. We had Sangakkara, is probably in the top 3 all-time batsmen, top 5 all-time batsmen.
I think he's got the second best average.
I mean, he's
since
up there.
Bradman.
He's up there, right? And then he's, in terms of wicket-keeper batsmen, I don't think there's a contest. I don't think there's anybody else out there. Who would you say is as good a wicket-keeper batsman?
Gilly, perhaps.
But Gilly was a low order. I mean, he wasn't a top order batsman.
True.
He could play top order,
yeah.
but in Test cricket especially, he always was number 6, number 7 when there was already 300-400 runs on the board. Then you had, even Mahela Javadan, one of our great modern captains in the game, recognized by the ICC, he's one that won the award. Dilshan invented the Dil scoop. So we've done all this in the international game in just my lifetime. This is all my lifetime, right? But how did we reach a point where we weren't be able to pay people's contracts? We weren't able to attract TV sponsorship. We couldn't even organize a tour at some points in Sri Lanka. So, I mean, there's only so much the talent can take us, and if you can draw a parallel to this current team where there's no stars like that I've mentioned in this team, maybe a few, but how do you see our current T20 team and our current one-day international team?
Well, I think cricket administration also is a professional thing, Kusum. And we've got this thing in the sports law which says that most of the constitutions say that you have to have played the game at a certain level in order to be able to administrate it. But it's not often that you are a good administrator if you've played sports at a higher level. In fact, I would say that it's an antithesis because you've spent so much of your life on the field and you may know that area of the game inside out. But you've missed out on some of the life skills that a lot of other people have been acquiring in terms of maybe doing academic qualifications, understanding processes, sitting out from the outside and watching how things are going to be managed. So Sri Lanka cricket hasn't been as professional perhaps as its counterparts in other parts of the world. And maybe that's why it's only when you read out that list of innovations and innovators that we've had in the game that it struck me just how much we have contributed to Sri Lanka, to world cricket. And why aren't we talking about it more? And that's something that Sri Lanka cricket needs to be doing. We need to be pushing other boards to tour more. We need to be saying, we don't want a Darwin test, we want an MCG test, that kind of stuff. We need to be able to do at the board level. And I don't think we really have the punch yet for that stuff to be taken seriously at the board table as much as we are taken on the field.
So if we look at, Shanaka, the T20 victory, the Asian Cup, it feels like the World Cup, but it's not, right?
Yeah.
It's the Asia Cup. The World Cup is in October, November. How much of this team will carry on into those conditions?
I think most of it will play. The squad is a strong squad, and I think we have good backups for the first choices as well. Dushmantha Chamira is still to come into this. Kushal Janit Pereira, don't know whether he still has a place, but he's also someone who still needs to come into this mix. So we've got quite a few guys that are in and around this. But I did take a look at the 2 groups yesterday, and even if Sri Lanka qualifies and goes into one of those groups, you're looking at England, Australia, South Africa, the West Indies, India, Pakistan, playing pretty well.
Tough.
It's going to be tough. It's going to be really tough. And we're going to have to play well, which is what really heartened me about this Asia Cup victory, because it wasn't an easy victory. We had to come back from a really dodgy position, and we still managed to do that. And if they take that heart with them, who knows? We're kind of in the same position we were in the 96
How
World
do you
Cup.
see the batting lineup, Shanaka? Because I feel like the middle order is still brittle, a little bit unsure of himself.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Kusal Mendis opening, really. I think he's our best number 4. We've got Dhanushka Wijetilleke, we've got Niroshan Dikwal. Pathum Nissanka has been phenomenal. I think he's probably our best batsman across all 3 formats at the moment, and he's just so solid. But we're building partnerships, which is nice, and we seem to be building an understanding, which is nice, which I didn't see a few months ago. And they know when to drop and run. especially in the T20 game, and they're talking to each other, and you can see there's a bit of a camaraderie. So, Bhanuka Rajapaksa I thought was brilliant, but I think Kusal Mendis maybe at 4, Charith Asalanka at 5, Bhanuka at 6. That's a really solid lineup.
But where are the power hitters?
Well, these guys can clear the boundary. I think Bhanuka, Dasun Shanaka can clear the boundary. Chamika Karunaratne on his day can clear the boundary. Wanidu Hasaranga can wield that as well. But again, that's a physical thing, isn't it, Kusum? I mean, you and I walk into a room and somebody says, "Who do you think is going to hit the 6?" They'll say, "It's me." I can't connect the ball, but that's beside the point. They say that this is the guy that's going to get you over the line. So I remember during the underarm fiasco way back in the day with Trevor Chappell. He says that they needed 6, and it was Graham McKechnie, a New Zealand fast bowler, who had come in. And he was a big strapping guy, and Trevor Chappell says, if anybody could hit a 6 off the last ball, I thought he was going to be this guy. And that's why I bowled the underarm. So it's a function of physicality, and the boys have got stronger, they've got fitter, but I would like to see them putting on a little bit more muscle, a bit more fast twitch, and really being able to club that ball like the likes of David Warner and Josh Butler.
We've had some big guys play international cricket for Sri Lanka. Guru Singha was a famous guy, gentle giant, you know, very good at nurdling the ball around. Someone that was quite good was Avishka Gunawardena, who I think had that instinct that Jayasuriya had to just from ball one he was turned on, he could just hit the ball immediately. Again, didn't really translate at the international game, but I see a lot of other teams in T20 cricket today just have a few players that are down the order, they only need 5-6 deliveries, and I kind of feel like that is where we may just sort of fall short a little bit.
We forget how strong Sanat Jayasuriya was.
Exactly.
And he's got Popeye forearms. He just flicks the ball and it's 6.
I was watching a Viv Richards just on YouTube just for fun recently, and he's a right hand, plays a very similar shot. He picks up the ball just off a length and just uses his wrists. And that's literally what Sanat does. And Sanat hits that ball for 6 as a left-hander simply because the bats are bigger and stronger, and he's probably slightly got bigger forearms. Probably doesn't have the Vivian Richards shoulders, the shoulder width, but he's got pretty big. He's a pretty big guy. But a lot of the other nations, Australia, England, etc., they've built 2-3 distinct teams with a couple of players that are suited specifically to that format. Do you think we can go in that direction, or have we already started, or do you see a lot of overlap? Because I see very similar names coming in. But and then the test team comes. You have I don't want to mention names. It's not my industry, but there are test players with 20, 30, 40 tests who are batsmen, for example. That's their main job is to bat, and they're averaging 25, 30 in test cricket. So that's not a recipe for test victories.
No, it's not. It's not, and I think that's why our test victories will be few and far between, especially away from home. But when they come, they'll be spectacular. So that's just the way Sri Lanka has been. But I think there's room for 3 formats. I'm just not sure we have enough depth for the reasons we talked about way at the top of the show when we said that there's not enough competitive cricket being played below the international level. Because then you can go in and say, who is that big bloke swinging the ball? Guys like Dilhara Lokohettige. We need to be able to bring those guys in and keep them in the system for long enough for when they come good. Because you look at Australia, guys like James Faulkner, where are they now? They just come in, they do a job, and they go out. So we need to be able to bring that conveyor belt of players, talented players, through the system.
Do we appreciate the Dravid skill set in the game today? I mean, it seems like especially
not in T20.
Yeah, and in that case, if everyone's looking to get into the T20 game, is that player going to find their place even in the Premier League game in a 50-over match? How are they going to make it there? Because it's so different. I mean, I played briefly in England, and it's a completely different ball game, if you use the term, because the swing, the pitches, the conditions, the wind, even those little things. You need to have a very different kind of technique to succeed. You're not going to be a Jayasuriya. Not everyone with Jayasuriya's technique is going to make a 200 in Test cricket. So how do we develop those kinds of players in our system when there's now all this commercial pressure? As you know, Sri Lankans also have to make a career. They go into cricket to make some money as well. And when that pressure comes along, you probably find those players who are of the Athapattu ilk kind of being shunned for someone who's,
Yeah,
you know, a little
yeah, you could, and I think the fate has befallen guys like Dimut Karnaratne, who I think is a very good batsman. Could probably be in our one-day side as well quite easily. Yeah, it's a skill set that is being slowly eroded, Kusum, and I think we're worse off for it. I mean, it's nice to be able to see bowlers on a really bouncy wicket or a seaming wicket giving the batsman hell and the batsman being able to cope. You know, that's nothing nicer than watching that kind of
having those leaves.
Yeah.
You know. Just before we wrap up, I wanted to get your thoughts because I've heard you have these conversations on the radio all those years ago. So I wonder if you still so you can answer in depth or not. But Lara or Tendulkar?
Lara by a long way.
How
it's
come?
Not even the same ballpark. I would
Statistically?
pay good money to watch Brian Lara play. I wouldn't watch Tendulkar on TV if he was.
Really? Even with someone like, say, Shane Warne, who has regularly said that, you know, Tendulkar would give him nightmares, not so much Lara.
I think that's probably because I remember this moment vividly from 1992, Kusum. Australia were hosting the Benson and Hedges Cup, and Shane Warne was bowling to Brian Lara. He hit 90 off the last 10 overs to win that game. And this was when hitting 90 off the last 10 was just not even thought of. I remember Tony Greig interviewing after the game, and he said, yeah, when I knew Shane Warne was coming out to bowl, I knew it 9 runs and over was not going to be a problem. So these guys had their little run-ins all the way through, but I would pay good money to watch Shane Warne bowl to Brian Lara.
Sangha or Aravinda?
Aravinda. No disrespect to Sangha, he's a good bloke, but Aravinda is a tough
Yeah,
one.
how good do you think Aravinda could have been in this era? Because we know
I think we have to ask Sangha that if he didn't run him out in 2003, we'd still
he
be talking
could have been
about
playing.
that.
Because Aravinda was that rare player who could do it all, right? He could take off from ball one, and that's kind of how he preferred to play, I think. Yeah. Something I saw in Mahel as well when he was promoted to open in T20s late in his career. He was extremely comfortable just chipping the ball over the infield. So I look at Aravinda and T20 cricket. I mean, I don't want to talk about Sarath and T20 cricket because I think he would have changed it completely. But someone like Aravinda in today's T20 game, I think would have created a few shots. I think his own shots.
I think Aravinda was second only to Viv Richards in the way that maybe not even second. He was. I went back and had a look at that semi-final against Australia in 2003, and he was.
Brett Lee.
Oh my God, he was just.
Was it in South? That was
South Africa.
Centurion, I think.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
He is unbelievable. He was just on his day. He's never been better. And
with all due respect to Shane Warne, I think Warne or Murali. Are you going to get controversial?
I really enjoyed watching Shane Warne bowl. I liked the theatre about it. I like how he'd set up batsmen. I liked how aggressive he was. So it was more than just the bowling, which I think Murali was as good. But just the theatre around Shane Warne, the flair with which he did the same thing that Murali did, I think won.
Would you say there's an argument that if Shane Warne had bowled to so many overs to Bangladesh and Zimbabwe, etc., that he'd get way more wickets? But if Murali had bowled as many overs to England?
We were discussing this coincidentally very recently. And there's two schools of thought to that. Yes, Murali did get a lot of wickets on spinning tracks and against Bangladesh, against Zimbabwe perhaps. But let's not forget that Murali was the only one that other players had to defend against when they were playing. I mean, after Vasa's first spell, a lot of players could just block Murali's overs and just score off the rest of them. Whereas with Warne, there was no let-up. He would come on after Brett Lee and Glenn McGrath had softened people up, Jason Gillespie, you know. So there was always pressure from both ends when Shane Warne was bowling. And I think that really did help him get quite a few of those wickets.
If he played as many tests against England as Shane Warne did.
Yeah.
Exactly. 1,000 wickets by now, definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
Shanaka, thanks a lot for doing this. I appreciate it. It's a real... It's not often you get to speak to someone you listened on the radio when you were a kid, and I used to not agree with some of your cricketing things, but yeah, I think we can get along now. So thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot.